From Castle Rexworth and the Rexworth Estates, I bid you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. My name is Rexworth, Lord Rexworth, and I welcome you to a special Tuesday night stream. Tuesday nights are not normally a time that I stream, but I just felt this week that something just was urging me on. An instinct I felt. Stream on Tuesday and do another reading ASMR while you're at it. That's something that something has been telling me that I need to be doing more of that, because it just seems to be something that not only is the format easy enough for me to do, I mean, it's something as simple as just me reading a book to you, but it also seems to be something that all of you, my dear nobles, enjoy immensely. So you know what? I'm a big believer in giving the people what they want. So more reading ASMR it is. I hope you'll agree with that, and I hope I'm able to read the room and read my audience properly, to know whether or not this is actually something that you want. But I'm also a big believer in experimentation, finding something that works, finding something that I enjoy and that the audience enjoys, and just making it happen. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to be doing some reading ASMR of a work of fiction. We're going to be reading selections from the series known as The Saint by Leslie Charteris. Those of you, perhaps if you're fans of old television shows, you may know this as a show back in the 1960s that was on ITV in Britain and was syndicated worldwide. It starred the late Sir Roger Moore as Simon Templar, aka the Saint. He was this a reformed master thief and criminal who had turned over a new leaf in life and went around helping people. Sort of a solo act version of what you might see on the television show Leverage, only instead of a team, it was just Sir Roger as Simon Templar. And he was taking his formerly villainous powers and using them for good. So there you have it. If you've never seen an episode of The Saint before, you can actually go and find them on YouTube. I believe Shout Factory in North America has the first few episodes of The Saint available to watch on YouTube on demand, and they're also available on Amazon Prime. So it's a fantastic series. It started out in black and white. Last few series were in color, and then there was another one that came along in the 1970s called Return of the Saint, and that starred Ian Ogilvy as Simon Templar. That one played a little more closer to the character and to the portrayal in the Charteris novels. And then there was Simon Dutton in the 1980s. In a series of television movies that played the Saint, and those were supposed to be even closer to the play even closer to the books. And then, of course, there was the rather universally panned film with Val Kilmer as Simon Templar in the 90s. Be lurking doing homework. All right, Pink, that's all right. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining me here tonight. This is going to be an archive stream. Leslie Charteris sadly passed away many decades ago. I think it's safe enough that we can archive this and put it up on YouTube for a VOD. So I will be recording this and I will be posting a VOD later on. But let's go ahead and get the usual plugs in. The website, all links available at lordrexworth.com. That is lordrexworth.com. You can also support his lordship through purchases at the Throne Shop, items specially curated by me, and I do receive a small commission from their sale. lordrexworth.store. lordrexworth.store. And then, of course, I've got my own throne page. Gifts are always appreciated, but certainly not required by his lordship. You can check out my throne page at throne.com/Lord Rexworth. We got the tip jar out. You can support his lordship directly with a donation via Stream Elements. The link is there in the chat, streamelements.com/Lord Rexworth/tip. And then, of course, we'd be remiss if we did not mention our sponsors for tonight. First one tonight is Dubby. Some of you may be wondering what Dubby is. That is an energy drink you mix at home. No jitters, no crash. It is, and it's also cheaper than buying coffee at the fancy coffee places. I actually had some business near where I live, and took me to a rather posh part of town, and they had one of those fancy coffee places there within the skyscraper that I was having my meeting, and would you believe they wanted about $2 and change for a bottle of water, and they wanted about $5-7 for a simple coffee. That's highway robbery, I think. So I rather like Dubby. It's easier on the stomach compared to the acidic nature of a lot of the coffees there at the fancy coffee places. You can have Dubby served up. It's only $1 per serving, if you can believe that. I know I certainly can. And in this day and age, with inflation out of control, with the cost of living out of control, we need to make economies wherever we can. And Dubby is a perfect way to get your caffeine fix without breaking the bank. So why Dubby? Why Dubby in particular? Well, it's something special. It's formulated to give you focus and energy with no jitters or crash. And the Dubby formula contains vitamins, amino acids, and nootropics, including the patented neurofactor. Dubby contains no calories, no sugar, no maltodextrin, that's all that corn-based nonsense, no fillers, no artificial colors, no nonsense in general. I know I'm addicted to caffeine, lol. Yeah, same here. It's, especially the days I've got to be up early. I am dragging unless I get some caffeine in me. And the great thing about Dubby is that it's formulated from green coffee extract, and it gives you all the energy you need without jitters, without the crash, and it's also easier on my stomach as well. I have never really been much of a coffee drinker, just because of the acidic nature of coffee. It tends to upset my stomach after a while. But there's caffeinated teas, and then there's also Dubby here, which is just a fantastic product. Go to dubby.gg and use the code Lord Rexworth, all one word, at checkout, and you'll get 10% off your order. That's dubby.gg and use the code Lord Rexworth, all one word, for 10% off, or just click that link in chat. Dubby's also portable. Go with the sample packs so you can take them anywhere. Yes, that's right. If you click on Shop Now, they have a starter sampler pack. So perhaps you're not sure which flavor you like. You want to try a variety of them. Well, Dubby's got you covered with that starter sampler pack with 4 of the primary delicious flavors. You get the Dragonade, which is the dragon fruit and pink strawberry lemonade. You get Dub Sludge, which is the Granny Smith apple flavor mixed in with their secret sauce. Beach and Peach, which is mango white peach cooler. And Galaxy Grenade, which is a blend of watermelon, guava, and lime explosion. Dubby.gg, dubby.gg. Use the code Lord Rexworth at checkout for 10% off your order. Dubby, be better. And we're also brought to you tonight by Wise. Simon Templar is a well-traveled man, very much like another English hero of sorts, with a certain 00 number and a license to kill. And when you're traveling, you may run into the issue of hefty conversion fees, ATM charges, even foreign transaction fees of 3% or even more when you're traveling. It's making the banks richer and it's making you poorer, and that's just not right. But the Wise multi-currency account and debit card helps to solve that problem. You can convert money before the trip at mid-market exchange rates plus a small upfront fee. Then when you reach your travel destination, you simply pay with your Wise debit card or withdraw at ATMs with free withdrawals up to $250 each month. And with that Wise debit card, there are no foreign transaction fees. None. Zero. When traveling abroad, consider Wise. With their multi-currency account and debit card, you can spend and withdraw money in over 40 currencies from local ATMs, and it's much cheaper than using your local bank. Start spending like a local, my friends. Start sending and receiving money like a local. Wise up, my peeps. Be wise with Wise. Yes, wise up, nobles. And then finally, let's go ahead and get our next sponsor out of the way, and that is the Cash App. Try the Cash App using my code, and we'll both get $5 when you link a new bank account and send $5. Click the link in chat and use my code. Link your bank account, send $5, you get $5 with the Cash App, available on iOS and Android devices. The Cash App. I love it. I love it. Thank you, Bink. Thank you. Let's see. All right. We're going to start off with a book, a collection of short stories called Follow the Saint. And I want to begin with the foreword to this edition that I have here, written by Adrian Magson. It might seem odd for a Saint fan to recall one particular volume over another, and to be honest, it wasn't easy. But Follow the Saint seems to resonate most for me because it brings together various aspects about the series which go to make Simon Templar what he is. Indeed, the front cover blurb of some previous editions reads, "Nothing ordinary ever happens to the Saint." A statement which to me as a young boy held all the promise of a good read that I could possibly imagine and formulated my desire to write crime fiction. The book consists of 3 stories. The Miracle Tea Party opens with an introduction, for those who need it, to the Saint's main poking fun victim, Chief Inspector Claude Eustace Teal. As the hapless representative of Scotland Yard, Teal's shoulders had to cope with all the criticism that Templar loved heaping on the police. As the author states, Teal was allergic to the Saint. And like most allergies, it follows him around. Yet Teal was not merely a whipping post for the Saint's barbed wit. He was an important part of the Saint's story, an anchor point to the conventional world, and the exchanges between the two have a part to play. The Invisible Millionaire brings in another of the Saint's happy band, Hoppy Uniatz. Hoppy is an American gangster, short on brains, thinking him causes him pain, and looks, with a face like a gorilla, and with a love of VAT-69 and hitting people, or shooting them, either will do. He's a sharp contrast to the urbane Templar, but he has his uses and introduces an element of humor and handy violence when needed. Indeed, I think it was meeting Uniatz that eventually drew me to reading American crime fiction. The Affair of Hogsbotham displays the ability of the author to begin a story in an unremarkable way, Templar reading a newspaper and commenting on it to Patricia Home, his paramour and elegant sidekick, then to ramp it up by degrees into something less ordinary. It also allows him to comment on war briefly, on his annoyance with society's insistence on interfering with public morals, something the Saint has no time for, and most of all, to turn a profit from adversity by relieving the villains of some cold, hard cash. In all, Follow the Saint is a useful introduction to anyone new to this character, serving as a form of shorthand to Leslie Charteris's lovable rogue and the world he inhabits. That's from Adrian Magson. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin. Follow the Saint. The Miracle Tea Party. Chapter 1. This story starts with 4 wild coincidences, so we may as well admit them at once and get it over with, and then there will be no more argument. The chronicler makes no apologies for them. A lot of much more far-fetched coincidences have been allowed to happen without protest in the history of the world, and all that can be done about it is to relate them exactly as they took place. And if it should be objected that these particular coincidences led to the downfall of sundry criminals who might otherwise never have been detected, it must be pointed out that at least half the convicts at present taking a cure in the cooler were caught that way. Chief Inspector Claude Eustace Teal sat in a tea shop that was not much more than a powerful stone's throw from Scotland Yard. Dispassionately considered, it was quite a suitable target for stone throwing, being one of those dens of ghastly chintz-curtained cheerfulness which stand as grisly omens of what the English-speaking races can expect from a few more generations of purity and hygiene, but Mr. Teal held it in a sort of affection born of habit. He had finished his tea, and he sat glancing over a newspaper, and in order that there may be positively no deception about this, it must be admitted that at once that not even the most enthusiastic advocate of temperance would have chosen him as an advertisement of the place that he was in. Mr. Teal, in fact, who even at his best suffered from certain physical disadvantages which made it permanently impossible for him to model for a statue of Dancing Spring, was at that moment not even in the running for a picture of mellow autumn. His round pink face had a distinctly muddy tinge under its roseate bloom, The champing of his jaws on the invisible wodge of spearmint was visibly listless, and his china blue eyes contained an expression of joyless but stoical endurance. He looked, to speak with complete candor, rather like a discontented cow with a toothache. After a while, he put the newspaper aside and simply sat, gazing mournfully into space. It was a Sunday afternoon, and at that rather late hour he had a place to himself, except for a vacant-faced waitress who sat in a corner knitting some garment in a peculiarly dreadful shade of mustard yellow. A small radio on the mantelpiece, strategically placed between a vase of artificial flowers and a bowl of wax fruit, was emitting strains of that singularly lugubrious and eviscerated music which supplies the theme song of modern romance. Mr. Teal appeared to be enduring that infliction in the same spirit as Job might have endured the development of his 60-second boil. He looked as if he was only waiting for someone to come along and relieve him of the cares of the universe. Someone did come along, but not with that intention. The crash of the door opening made Mr. Teal's overwrought nerves wince, and when he saw who it was, he closed his eyes for a moment in sheer agony. For although Mr. William Kennedy was easily the most popular of the assistant commissioners, his vast and jovial personality was approximately the last thing that a man in Mr. Teal's condition is able to appreciate. "Hullo, laddie!" he roared, in a voice that boomed through the room like a gale. "What's the matter? You look like a cold poached egg left over from yesterday's breakfast. What are you doing, thinking about the saint?" Mr. Teal started, as if an electric current had been applied to his posterior. He had expected the worst, but this was worse than that. If anything could have been said to fill his cup of suffering to the brim, that something had been said. Mr. Teal now looked as if there was nothing left except for him to find some suitably awful spot in which to die. Scientists whose restless researches have no phenomenon unprobed have discovered that certain persons are subject to quite disproportionately grievous reactions from stimuli, which to other persons are entirely innocuous. These inordinate sensitivities are known as allergies. Some people are allergic to oysters, others to onions, others need only eat a strawberry to be attacked by violent pains and break out in a rash. Chief Inspector Teal was allergic to the saint, but it must be admitted that this was an acquired rather than a congenital allergy. It is true that Mr. Teal, on account of his profession, was theoretically required to be allergic to every kind of lawbreaker, but there was nothing in his implied contract with the state which required him to be pierced by such excruciating pains or to break out in such a vivid erythema as he was apt to do whenever he heard the name or nickname of that incorrigible outlaw who had been christened Simon Templar. But the saint was the kind of outlaw that no officer of the law can have ever had to cope with since the Sheriff of Nottingham was pestered into apoplexy by the Robin Hood of those more limited days. There was no precedent in modern times for anything like him, and Mr. Teal was convinced that it could only be taken as evidence of the deliberate maliciousness of fate that out of all the other police officers who might have been chosen for the experiment, the lot had fallen upon him. But there was no doubt at all in his mind that all the grief and woes which had been visited upon him in recent years could be directly attributed to that amazing buccaneer whose unlawful excursions against evildoers had made criminal history, and yet whose legal conviction and punishment was beginning to seem as hopelessly improbable an event as the capture of a genuine and indisputable sea serpent. Kennedy was not being deliberately cruel. It was simply his uninhibited proclamation of what was almost an automatic association of ideas to anyone who knew anything at all about Teal's professional life, that whenever Mr. Teal looked as if he was in acute agony, he was undergoing a spell of saint trouble. The fact that Mr. Teal, as it happened, had not been thinking about the saint at all when Kennedy came in only gave a reminder of a deeper power to wound. "No, sir," said Mr. Teal with the flimsiest quality of restraint. "I was not thinking about the saint. I haven't seen him for weeks. I don't know what he's doing, and what's more, I don't care." Kennedy raised his eyebrows. "Sorry, laddie. I thought from your appearance—" "What's wrong with my blasted appearance?" snarled the detective, with a reckless disregard for discipline of which in normal times he would never have been capable, but Kennedy had no great respect for trivial formalities. "Blasted is right," he agreed readily. "You look like something the lightning had started out to strike and then given up as a work of supererogation. What is it, then? Have you been getting hell for falling down on that espionage business?" Mr. Teal was able to ignore that. It was true that he had made very little headway with the case referred to, but that was not worrying him unduly. When official secrets spring a leak, it's usually a slow job to trace the leakage to its source, and Teal was too old a hand to let himself be disturbed by the slowness of it. His trouble was far more intimate and personal, and the time has now come when it must be revealed. Mr. Teal was suffering from indigestion. It was a complaint that had first intruded itself on his consciousness some weeks ago, since when its symptoms had become steadily more severe and regular, until by this time he had come to regard a stomachache as the practically inevitable sequel to any meal he ate. Since Mr. Teal's tummy constituted a very large portion of Mr. Teal, his sufferings were considerable. They made him pessimistic and depressed and more than usually morose. His working days had become long hours of discomfort and misery, and it seemed an eternity since he had spent a really restful and dreamless night. Even now, after having foregone his Sunday dinner in penitence for the price he had to pay for bacon and eggs at breakfast, the cream bun to whose succulent temptation he had not long ago succumbed was already beginning to give him the unhappily familiar sensation of having swallowed a live and singularly vicious crab. And this was the mortal dolour of in addition to which he had to receive a superfluous reminder of the saint. The waitress at last succeeded in gaining audience. "Yes, boomed Kennedy, tea, strong tea, and about half a ton of hot butter crumpets." Mr. Teal closed his eyes again as another excruciating cramp curled through him. In his darkened loneliness, he became aware that the music had been interrupted and the radio was talking. "And this amazing tea is not only guaranteed to relieve indigestion immediately, but to effect a complete and permanent cure," said a clear young voice with a beautiful Oxford accent. "Every day we are receiving fresh testimonials." "My God," said Teal with a shudder. "Where is that Erica little by little dribbling from?" "Radio Calvados," answered Kennedy. "One of the few continental stations. They go to work every Sunday. I suppose we'll have to put up with it as long as the BBC refuses to produce anything but string quartets and instructive talks on Sundays." "Miracle Tea," said Eric, continuing little by little. "Remember that name, Miracle Tea, obtainable from all high-class chemists, or direct by post from the Miracle Tea Company, 909 Victoria Street, London. Buy some Miracle Tea tonight. And now we shall conclude this program with our signature song, Tea for You." Mr. Teal held on to his stomach as the anguishing parody proceeded to rend the air. "Miracle tea," he rasped savagely. "What'll they think of next? As if tea could cure indigestion. Pah!" The way he said "pah" almost blew his front teeth out, and Kennedy glanced at him discerningly. "Oh, so that's the trouble, is it? The mystery is solved." "I didn't say," Kennedy grinned at him. The door of the tea shop opened again to admit Inspector Peters, Kennedy's chief assistant. "Sorry I was so long, sir," he apologized, taking the vacant chair at their table. "The man was out." "Oh, never mind that. Teal's got indigestion." "You can fix that with a bit of bicarb," said Peters helpfully. "So long as it isn't something more serious," said Kennedy, reaching for a freshly arrived plate of hot buttered crumpets with a hand like a leg of mutton and the air of massive confidence which can only be achieved by a man of Herculean physique who knows that his interior would never dare to give him any back chat. "I've been noticing his face lately. I must say I've been worried about it, but I didn't like to mention it before he brought it up." "Oh, you mean the twitching?" asked Peters. "No, not so much the twitching as the jaundiced color. It looks bad to me." "Oh, damn it," began Teal explosively. "Axolotl, Novell, welcome in. We're just getting underway with our readings of The Saint by Leslie Charteris." "Acid," pronounced Kennedy, engulfing crumpets. "That's generally the beginning of the trouble. Too much acid swirling around the lining of your stomach, and where are you? In next to no time, you're a walking mass of gastric ulcers. You know what happens when a gastric ulcer eats into a blood vessel?" "You bleed to death?" asked Peters interestedly. "Like a shot," said Kennedy, apparently unaware of the fact that Teal was starting to simmer and splutter like a pan full of hot grease. "I've seen even worse, when the ulcer makes a whacking great hole in the wall of the stomach and your dinner falls through into the abdominal cavity." Mr. Teal clung to his chair and wished he had been born deaf. It was no consolation at all to him to recall that it had actually been the saint himself who had started the fashion of making familiar and even disgusting comments on the shape and dimensions of the stomach under discussion, a fashion which Mr. Teal's own colleagues, to their eternal disgrace, had been surprisingly quick to adopt. And now that it had been revealed that his recent irritability had been caused by acute indigestion, the joke would take a new lease of life. It is a curious but undeniable fact that a man may have a headache or a toothache or an earache and receive nothing but sympathy from those about him, but let his stomach ache, and all he can expect is the facetiousness of the most callous and offensive kind. Mr. Teal's stomach was a magnificently well-developed organ, measuring more inches from east to west than he cared to calculate, and he was perhaps excessively sensitive about it, but in its present condition, the most faintly flippant reference to it was exquisite torment. He stood up. "Please excuse me, sir," he said with as much dignity as he could muster. "I've got a job to do this evening." "Don't forget to buy your medical tea on your way home," was Kennedy's farewell. Mr. Teal walked up Victoria Street in the direction of his modest lodgings. He had no job to do at all, but it would have been physically impossible for him to have stomached another minute of the conversation he had left behind him. He walked because he had not far to go, and the exercise helped to distract his thoughts from the feeling that his intestines were being gnawed by a colony of hungry rats. Not that the distraction was by any means complete. The rats continued their remorseless depredations, but he was able to give them only half his attention instead of the whole of it. In the circumstances, it was perhaps natural that the broadcast which had been added to his current grief should remain vaguely present in the background of his mind. The address given had been in Victoria Street, and therefore it was perhaps not such a wild coincidence after all that he should presently have found himself gazing at a large show card in the window of the chemist's shop, which he must have been passing practically every day for the last 2 months. "Indigestion, try medical tea. 2.6 the packet." Mr. Teal was not even averagely gullible, but a man in his state of mind is not fully responsible for his actions. The tribulations of the last few weeks had reduced him to a state of desperation, in which he would have tried a dose of prussic acid if it had been recommended with sufficient promises of alleviating his distress. With a furtive glance around him, as if he was afraid of being caught in a disreputable act, he entered the shop and approached the counter, behind which stood a shifty-eyed young man in a soiled white coat. "A packet of medical tea," said Mr. Teal, lowering his voice to a mumble, although the shop was empty, as though he had been asking for some unmentionable merchandise. He planked down a half-crown with unconvincing defiance. The assistant hesitated for a moment, turned, and took an oblong yellow packet from a shelf behind him. He hesitated again, still holding it, as if he was reluctant to part with it. "Yes, sir," he said suggestively. "What do you mean, yes, sir?" blared Mr. Teal with the belligerence of increasing embarrassment. "Isn't there something else, sir?" "No, there isn't anything else," retorted the detective, whose sole remaining ambition was to get out of the place as quickly as possible with his guilty purchase. "Give me that stuff and take your money." He reached over and fairly snatched the yellow packet out of the young man's hand, stuffed it into his pocket, and lumbered out as if he were trying to catch a train. He was in such a hurry that he almost bowled over another customer who was just entering the shop, and this customer, for some reason, quickly averted his face. Mr. Teal was too flustered even to notice him. He went plodding more rapidly than usual on his homeward way, feeling as if his face were a bright crimson, which would announce his shame to any passer-by, and never dreaming that destiny had already grasped him firmly by the scruff of the neck. 5 minutes later, he was trudging through a narrow side street within a couple of blocks of his apartment. The comatose dusk of Sunday evening lay over it like a shroud. Not a single other human creature was in sight, and the only sound, apart from the solid tread of his own regulation boots, was a patter of hurried footsteps coming up behind him. There was nothing in that to make him turn his head. The footsteps caught up until they were almost on his heels. Then something hit him with a terrific blow on the side of the head, and everything dissolved into black darkness. Chapter 2. Simon Templar's views on the subject of Chief Inspector Teal, unlike Chief Inspector Teal's views on the subject of the saint, were apt to fluctuate between very contradictory extremes. There were times when he felt that life would lose half its savor if he were deprived of the perpetual joy of dodging Teal's constant frantic efforts to put him behind bars. But there were other times when he felt that his life would be a lot less strenuous if Teal's cardinal ambition had been a little less tenacious. There had been times when he had felt sincere remorse for the more bitter humiliations which he had sometimes been compelled to inflict upon Mr. Teal, even though these times had been the only alternatives to his own defeat in their endless duel. There had been other times when he could have derived much satisfaction from beating Teal over the head with a heavy bar of iron with large knobs on the end. One thing which the Saint was certain about, however, was that his own occasional urges to assault the detective's cranium with a blunt instrument did not mean that he was at any time prepared to permit any common or garden thug to take the same liberties with that long-suffering dome. This was the last of the coincidences of which due warning has already been given, that Simon Templar's long, sleek Hirondelle chanced to be taking a shortcut through the back streets of the district at that fateful hour, and whirled around a corner into the one street where it was most needed at the precise moment when Teal's ample body was spreading itself over the pavement as flat as a body of that architecture can conveniently be spread without the aid of a steamroller. The Saint's foot on the accelerator gave the great car a last burst in the direction of the spot where these exciting things were happening, and then he stood on the brakes. The thug who had committed the assault was already bending over Teal's prostrate form when the screech of skidding tires made him stop and look up in startled fear. For a split second he hesitated, as if considering whether to stand his ground and give battle, but something about the sinewy breadth of the Saint's shoulders and the athletic and purposeful speed with which the Saint's tall frame catapulted itself out of the still sliding car must have discouraged him. A profound antipathy to the whole scene and everyone in it appeared to overwhelm him, and he turned and began to depart from it like a stone out of a sling. The Saint started after him. At that moment the Saint had no idea that the object of his timely rescue was Chief Inspector Teal in person. It was simply the sight of one bloke hitting another bloke with a length of gas pipe was a spectacle which inevitably impelled him to join in the festivities with the least possible delay. But as he started in pursuit, he caught his first glimpse of the fallen victim's face, and the surprise checked his stride as if he had run into a wall. He paused involuntarily to confirm the identification, and that brief delay lost him any chance he might have had of making a capture. The thug was already covering the ground with quite remarkable velocity, and the extra start he had gained from the Saint's hesitation had given him a lead which even Simon Templar's long legs doubted their ability to make up. Simon gave up the idea with a regretful sigh and stooped to find out how much damage had been sustained by his favorite enemy. It only took him a moment to assure himself that his existence was unlikely to be rendered permanently uneventful by the premature removal of its most pungent spice. But nevertheless, there was also no doubt that Teal was temporarily in the land of dreams, and it would do the Saint himself no good to be found standing over his sleeping body. On the other hand, to leave Mr. Teal to finish his sleep in peace on the sidewalk was something which no self-respecting buccaneer could do. The actual commotion from which the situation had evolved had been practically negligible. Not a window had been flung up, not a door had been opened. The street remained sunken in its twilight torpor, and once again there was no other living soul in sight. The Saint shrugged. There seemed to be only one thing to do, so he did it. With a certain amount of effort, he picked up Mr. Teal's weighty person and heaved it into the car, dumped Teal's mackintosh and hat on top of him, and picked up an oblong yellow package which had fallen out of his pocket and slung that in as well, got into the driving seat himself, and drove away. That Simon's diagnosis had been accurate was proved by the fact that Teal was beginning to groan and blink his eyes when the Hirondelle pulled up at his front door. The Saint lit a cigarette and looked at him reproachfully. "I'm ashamed of you," he said, "an old man of your age, letting yourself be picked up in the gutter like that, and not even doing licensing hours either. Where did you get the embalming fluid?" "So it was you, was it?" Teal muttered thickly. "I beg your pardon?" "What the hell is the idea?" demanded Teal, with a growing indignation which left no doubt of his recovery. "The idea of what?" "Creeping up behind me, knocking me on the head. You think I'm going to let you get away with that?" "Claude," said the Saint, "do I understand that you're accusing me again?" "Oh, no." Teal had his eyes wide open now, and they were red with wrath. The edge of his sarcasm was as silky and delicate as the blade of a cross-cut saw. "No, it was two other people. They fell out of the sky with parachutes." The Saint sighed. I don't want to interrupt you, but can this great brain of yours see any particular reason why I should cost you today? We haven't seen each other for ages, and so far as I know, you haven't been doing anything to make me angry. And even if you had, and I thought it would be good for you to be bopped over the bean, do you think I'd take the trouble to bring you home afterwards? And even if I brought you home afterwards, do you think I'd let you wake up while I was still around instead of bopping you again and leaving you to wake up without knowing I'd been anywhere near you? I'm a very modest man, Claude, said the saint untruthfully, but there are some aspersions on my intelligence which cut me to the quick. And you always seem to be the guy who thinks of them. Mr. Teal rubbed his head. Well, what did happen? He demanded grudgingly. Well, I don't really know. When I shot over the horizon, there was some guy in the act of belting you over the lid with a handy piece of lead pipe. I thought of asking him to stop and talk it over, but he ran too fast. So I just loaded you into the old jalopy and brought you home. Of course, if you really wanted to go on dozing in the gutter, I can take you back. The detective looked about him. His aching skull was clearing a little, enough at least for him to be able to see that his latest misfortune was something which for once might not be chargeable to the saint's account. This realization did not actually improve his temper. You any idea who it was? Well, that's a large order, isn't it? If you're as charming to all your other clients as you usually are to me, I should say that London must be crawling with birds who pay large sums of money for the fun of whacking you on the roof with a lump of iron. Well, what did this one look like? Snarled Teal impatiently. I'm blowed if I could draw his picture, Claude. The light was pretty bad and he didn't stay very long. Medium height, ordinary build, thin face. Nothing definite enough to help you much, I'm afraid. Teal grunted. Presently, he said, oh, thanks anyway. He said it as if he hated to say it, which he did. Being under any obligation to the saint hurt him almost as much as his indigestion. Promptly, he wished he hadn't thought of that comparison. His stomach, reviving from a too fleeting anesthesia, reminded him that it was still his most constant companion. And now he had a sore and splitting head as well. He realized he felt about as unhappy as a man can feel. He opened the door of the car and took hold of his raincoat and bowler hat. Good night, he said. Good night, said the saint cheerfully. You know where I live, any time you decide you want a bodyguard. Mr. Teal did not deign to reply. He crossed the sidewalk rather unsteadily, mounted the steps of the house, and let himself in without looking back. The door closed again behind him. Simon chuckled as he let in the clutch and drove on towards the appointment to which he had been on his way. The episode which had just taken place would make a mildly amusing story to tell. Aside from that obvious face value, he didn't give it a second thought. There was no reason why he should. There must have been enough hoodlums in the metropolis with their long-cherished dreams of vengeance against Mr. Teal, aside from ordinary casual footpads, to account for the sprinting beater-up who had made such an agile getaway. The only entertaining angle was that coincidence should have chosen the saint himself, of all possible people, to be the rescuer. That was as much as the saint's powers of clairvoyance were worth on that occasion. 2 hours later, when he had parked the Hirondelle in the garage at Cornwall House, his foot kicked something out of the door as he got out. It was the yellow packet that had slipped out of Teal's pocket, which had fallen onto the floor and been left there forgotten by both men. Simon picked it up, and when he saw the label he sighed, and then grinned again. So that was a new depth to which Mr. Teal had sunk, and the revelation of the detective's dyspepsia would provide a little extra piquancy to their next encounter in badinage. He went on reading the exaggerated claims made for medical tea on the wrapper as he rode up in the elevator to his apartment. And as he read on, a new idea came to him, an idea which could only have found a welcome in such a scapegrace sense of mischief as the saint's. The product was called Miracle Tea, and there seemed to be no reason why it should not be endowed with miraculous properties before being returned to its owner. Chief Inspector Teal would surely be disappointed if it failed to perform miracles, and that could so easily be arranged. The admixture of a quantity of crushed cenopods together with a certain amount of powdered calomel, the indicated specific in all cases of concussion. In his own living room, the saint proceeded to open the packet with great care, in such a way that it could be sealed again and bear no trace of having been tampered with. Inside, there seemed to be a second paper wrapping. He took hold of one corner of it and pulled experimentally. A complete crumpled piece of paper came out in his fingers. Below that, there was another crumpled white pad, and after that, another. It went on until the whole package was empty, and the table on which he was working was covered with those creased white scraps. But no tea came to light. He picked up one of the pieces of paper and cautiously unfolded it, in case it should be the container of an individual dose. And then suddenly he sat quite still, while his blue eyes froze into netto pools of electrified ice as he realized what he was looking at. It was a Bank of England note for £50. Chapter 3. Miracle Tea, said the saint reverently. That's a good name for it. There were 30 of those notes, a total of £1,500 in unquestionably genuine cash, legal tender, and ripe for immediate circulation. There was a light step behind him, and Patricia Holmes' hand fell on his shoulder. "I didn't know you'd come in, boy," she said. And then she didn't go on. He felt her standing unnaturally still. After some seconds she said, "What have you been doing, breaking into the baby's money box?" Getting ready to write some letters," he said. "How do you like the new notepaper?" She pulled him round to face her. "Come on," she said. "I'd like to know when you're going to be arrested. What's the charge going to be this time? Burgling a bank?" He smiled at her. She was easy to smile at. Hair like ripe corn in the sun, a skin like rose petals, blue eyes that could be as wicked as his own, the figure of a young nymph, and something else that could not have been captured in any picture, something in her that laughed with him in all his misdeeds. "Tea drinking is the charge," he said. "I've signed the pledge, and henceforward this will be my only beverage." She raised her fist. "I'll push your face in, but it's true." He handed her the packet from which the money had come. She sat on the table and studied every side of it, and after that she was only more helplessly perplexed. "Go on," she said. He told her the story exactly as it happened. "And now you know just as much as I do," he concluded. "I haven't even had time to do any thinking on it. Maybe we needn't bother. We shall wake up soon, and everything will be quite all right." She put the box down again and looked at one of the notes. "Are they real? Oh, there isn't a doubt of it. Maybe you've got away with Teal's life savings. Maybe, but he's got a bank account. And can you really see Claude Eustace hoarding his worldly wealth in packets of patent tea? Then it must be evidence in some case he's working on. It could be. But again, why keep it in this box?" Simon turned the yellow packet over in his supple hands. "It was perfectly sealed before I opened it. Looked as if it had never been touched. Why should he go to all that trouble? And suppose it was evidence just as it stood. How did he know what the evidence was without opening it? If he didn't know, he'd surely have opened it on the spot in front of witnesses. And if he did know, he had no business to take it home. Besides, if he did know that he was carrying dangerous evidence, he wouldn't have had to think twice about what motive there might be for slugging him on his way home. But he didn't have the slightest idea what it was all about." Patricia frowned. Well, could he be taking graft? This might be a way of slipping him the money. Simon thought that over for a while, but in the end he shook his head. "We've said a lot of rude things about Claude Eustace in our time, but I don't think even we could ever have said that seriously. He may be a nuisance, but he's so honest that it runs out of his ears. And still again, he'd have known what he was carrying, and known what anybody who slugged him might have been after. And the first thing he did when he woke up would have been to see if he'd still got the dough. But he didn't. He didn't even fill in his pockets. But wasn't he knocked silly? Well, not that silly. Perhaps he was quite sure what had happened and didn't want to give himself away. With me sitting beside him? If he'd even thought he'd lost something valuable, it wouldn't have been quite so easy for me to convince him that I wasn't the warrior with the gas pipe. He could have arrested me himself and searched me on the spot without necessarily giving anything away." The girl shrugged despairingly. "All right, so you think of something." The saint lit a cigarette. "I suppose I'm balmy, but there's only one thing I can think of. Claude Eustace didn't have the foggiest idea what was in the packet. He had a pain in his tum-tum, and he just bought it for medicine on the way home. It was meant to be handed to someone else, and the fellow in the shop got mixed up. As soon as Teal's gone out with it, the right man comes in, and there's a good deal of commotion. Somebody realizes what's happened and goes dashing after Teal to get the packet back. He bends his blunt instrument over Teal's head and is just about to frisk him when I arrive and spoil everything, so then he has to lamb. I take Teal home, and Teal has something else to think about besides his tummy. So he forgets all about his medical tea, and I win it. And is it something to win? The saint's eyes were kindling with an impish excitement that had no direct connection with the windfall that had just dropped into his lap. Patricia did not need him to say any more to tell her what was going on in his mind. To the saint, any puzzle was a potential adventure, and the saint on the trail of adventure was a man transformed, a dynamic focus of ageless and superhuman forces against which no ordinary mortal could argue. She had known him so well for so many years, had known so long that he was beyond her power to change, even if she had wished to change him. She said slowly, "But what is the racket?" "That would be worth knowing," he said, and he had no need to say that he intended to know. He leaned back ecstatically. "Just think of it, darling. If we could only see the uproar and agitation that must be going on at this minute in the place where this tea came from." As a matter of record, the quality of the uproar and the agitation in the shop where Mr. Teal had made his purchase would not have disappointed him at all, although in fact it had preceded this conversation by some time. Mr. Henry Osbert, registered proprietor of the drugstore at 909 Victoria Street, which was also the registered premises of the Medical Tea Company, was normally a man of quite distinguished and even haughty aspect, being not only tall and erect, but also equipped with a pair of long and gracefully curved moustaches, which stuck out on either side of his face like the wings of a soaring gull, which gave him a rather old-fashioned military air in spite of his horn-rimmed glasses. Under the stress of emotion, however, his dignity was visibly frayed. He listened to his shifty-eyed assistant's explanations with fuming impatience. "How was I to know?" the young man was protesting. "He came at exactly the right time, and I've never seen Nancock before. I didn't mean to give him the packet without the password, but he snatched it right out of my hand and rushed off." "Excuses," snarled the chemist, absent-mindedly grabbing handfuls of his whiskers and tying them in knots. "If you'd even known who he was." I didn't know, not until Nancock told me. How could I know?" "At least you could have got the package back." The other swallowed. "I'd have only got myself caught," he said sullenly. That chap who jumped out of the car was twice my size. He'd have killed me." Mr. Osbert stopped maltreating his moustache and looked at him for a long moment in curiously contrasting immobility. "That might have saved someone else the trouble," he said. And the tone in which he said it made the young man's face turn grey. Osbert's cold stare lasted for a moment longer, and then he took a fresh grip on his whiskers and turned and scuttled through to the back of the shop. One might almost have thought that he had gone off in a full flush of enthusiasm to fetch an axe. Beyond the dispensing room, there was a dark staircase. As he mounted the stairs, his gait and carriage changed in subtle ways, until it was as if a different man had entered his clothes. On the upper landing, his movements were measured and deliberate. He opened a door and went into a rather shabby and nondescript room which served as his private office. There were 2 or 3 old-fashioned filing cabinets, a littered desk with the polish worn off of the edges, a dingy carpet, and a couple of junk store chairs. Mr. Osbert sat down at a desk and opened a packet of cheap cigarettes. He was a very worried man, and with good reason, but he no longer looked flustered. He had, at that moment, a very cold-blooded idea of his position. He was convinced that Teal's getaway with a packet of medical tea had been neither premeditated nor intentional. Otherwise, there would have been further developments before this. It had simply been one of those fantastic accidents which lie in wait for the most careful conspiracies. That was a certain consolation, but not much. As soon as the contents of the packet were opened, there would be questions to answer. And while it was quite certain that nothing criminal could be proved from any answers he cared to give, it would still make him the object of an amount of suspicious attention which might easily lead to disaster later. There remained the chance that Teal might not decide to actually take a dose of medical tea for some hours yet. It was a chance that had to be seized quickly. After another moment's intensive consideration, Mr. Osbert picked up the telephone. Chapter 4. Simon Templar had been out and come in again after a visit to the nearest chemist. Now he was industriously stirring an interesting mixture in a large basin borrowed from the kitchen. Patricia Holmes sat in an armchair and watched him despairingly. "Did you ever hear a proverb about little things pleasing little minds?" she said. Unabashed, the saint put down his spoon and admired his handiwork. To any but the most minute examination, it looked exactly like a high-grade small-leaf tea, and some of it was. The other ingredients were hardly less ordinary, except in that particular combination. "Did you ever hear another proverb about a prophet in his own country?" he answered. "If you had a little more reverence for my mind, you'd see that it was nearly double its normal size. Don't you get the idea?" "Not yet." "This is what I originally meant to do. Now, maybe it wasn't such a huge idea then, although if I could get enough little ideas that handed me 1,500 quid at a time, I wouldn't worry so much about passing up the big stuff. But still, that was just good, clean fun. Now it's more than that. If I'm right and Teal doesn't know what he had in his pocket this afternoon, we don't want him to even start thinking about it. Therefore, I just want to return him his miracle tea, and I'll be sure he won't give it another thought. But I never had any miracle tea. Therefore, I've got to concoct a possible substitute. I don't know the original formula, but if this recipe doesn't live up to the name, I'll drink a gallon of it." "Of course," she said. "You couldn't just go out and buy another packet to give him." Simon gazed at her in stunned admiration. "Could you believe I never thought of that?" "No," said Patricia. "Maybe you're right," said the saint ruefully. He gave the basin another stir and shrugged. "Anyway," he said, "it'd be a pity to waste all this work, and the chance of a lifetime as well." He sat down at the table and cheerfully proceeded to pack his own remarkable version of miracle tea into the original carton. Having stuffed it full, he replaced the seals and wrappings with as much care as he had removed them, and when he had finished, there was not a trace to show that the package had ever been tampered with. "What will you do if he dies?" asked the girl. "Send a wreath of tea roses to his funeral," said the saint. He put down the completed packet after he had inspected it closely from every angle, and moved himself over to a more comfortable lounging site on the settee. His eyes were alert and hot with the gathering zest of devilment. "Now we go into the second half of this brilliant conspiracy. What does that mean? Finding out where Claude Eustace buys 1,500 quid for $half. Just think, sweetheart. We can go shopping once a week and keep ourselves in caviar without ever doing another stroke of work." He reached for the telephone and set it on his lap while he dialed Teal's private number with a swift and dancing forefinger. The telephone, he knew, was beside Teal's bed, and the promptness with which his ring was answered established the detective's location with quite miraculous certainty. "I hope," said the saint with instantaneous politeness, "that I haven't interrupted you in the middle of any important business, Claude." The receiver did not actually explode in his ear. It was a soundly constructed instrument designed to resist spontaneous detonation. It did, however, appear to feel some strain in reproducing the cracked foghorn cadence in which the answering voice said, "Who's that?" "And how," said the saint, "is the little tum-tum tonight?" Mr. Teal did not repeat his question. He had no need to. There was only one voice in the whole world which was capable of inquiring after his stomach with the exact inflection which was required to make that hypersensitive organ curl up into tight knots that sent red and yellow flashes squirting across his eyeballs. Mr. Teal did not groan aloud, but a mute organic groan swept through him like a cramp from his fingertips to his toes. It is true that he was in bed. And it is also true that he had been interrupted in the middle of some important business. But that important business had been simply and exclusively concerned with trying to drown his multitudinous woes in sleep. For a man in the full bloom of health to be smitten over the knob with a blunt instrument is usually a somewhat trying experience, but for a man in Mr. Teal's dyspeptic condition to be thus beamed is ultimate disaster. Mr. Teal now had two fearful pains rivaling for his attention, which he had been trying to give to neither. The only way of evading this responsibility which he had been able to think of had been to go to bed and go to sleep, which is what he had set out to do as soon as the saint had left him at his door, but sleep had steadfastly eluded him until barely 5 minutes before the telephone bell had blared its recall to conscious suffering into his anguished ear. And when he became aware that the emotions which he had been caused by that recall had been wrung out of him for no better object than to answer some saintly badinage about his abdomen, his throat closed up so that it was an effort for him to breathe. Is that all you want to know? He got out a strangled squawk. Because if so, oh, but it bothers me, Claude. You know how I love your tummy. It would break my heart if anything went wrong with it. Who told you anything was wrong with it? Only my famous deductive genius, or do you mean to tell me you drink medical tea because you like it? There was a pause. With the aid of television, Mr. Teal could have been seen to wriggle. The belligerent blare crumpled out of his voice. "Oh," he said weakly. "What medical tea?" "The stuff you had in your pocket this afternoon. I threw it into the car with your other things when I picked you up, but we forgot it when you got out. I just found it. Guaranteed cure indigestion, colic, flatulence, constipation, venomous bile, spots before the eyes. I didn't know you had so many troubles, Claude." "I haven't!" Teal roared defiantly. His stomach promptly performed two complicated and unprecedented evolutions and made a liar of him. He winced and floundered. I just happened to hear it advertised on the radio, and I saw another advertisement in a shop window on the way home, so I thought I'd try some. I haven't been feeling very fit lately." "Well, then I certainly think you ought to try something," said the saint charitably. "I'll beetle over with your poison right away, and if I can help you with a spot of massage, you only have to say the word." Mr. Teal closed his eyes. Of all the things he could think of which might aggravate his miseries, a visit from the saint at that time was the worst. "Thanks," he said with frantic earnestness, "but all I want now is to get some sleep. Bring it over some other time, Saint." Simon reached thoughtfully for a cigarette. "Just as you like, Claude. Shall we say the Mayfair tomorrow, 4 o'clock? "You could send it round," Teal said desperately, "or just throw it away. I can get some more if it's any bother." "No bother at all, dear old Collywobble. Let's call it a date. Tomorrow at 4. We'll have a cup of tea together." The saint laid the telephone gently back on its bracket and replaced it on the table beside him. His thumb flicked over the wheel of his lighter, and the tip of his cigarette kindled to a glow that matched the brightening gleam of certainty in his blue eyes. He had obtained all the information he wanted without pressing a single conspicuous question. Mr. Teal had bought his medical tea on the way home, and Simon knew that Mr. Teal's way home across Parliament Square and up Victoria Street was so rigidly established by years of unconscious habit that a blind man could almost have followed it by tracing the groove which the detective's regulation boots must by that time have worn along the pavement. Even if there were more than one chemist along that short trail with a medical tea advertisement in the window, the process of elimination could not take long. Patricia was watching him. She said, "So what?" "So we were right," said the saint, and his voice was lilting with incorrigible magic. "Claude doesn't give a damn about his tea. Doesn't mean a thing in his young life. He doesn't care if he never sees it again. He just bought it by a fluke, and he doesn't even know what sort of fluke it was." "Are you sure?" asked Patricia cautiously. "If he just doesn't want you to suspect anything—" The saint shook his head. "I know Claude's voice as much too well. If he'd tried to get away with anything like that, I should have heard it. And why should he try? I offered to bring it round at once, and he could have just said nothing and let me bring it. Why should he take any risk at all of something going wrong when he could have had the package back in half an hour? Teal may look dumb sometimes, but you can't see him being so dumb as that." Simon stood up, and his smile was irresistibly expectant. "Come out into the wide world with me, darling. Let's look for this shop where they sell medicals." His energy carried her off like a tide race. The deep purr of the Hirondelle as he drove it at fantastic speed to Parliament Square was in tune with his mood. Why it should have happened again like this, he didn't know, but it might as well have been this way as any other. Whatever the way, it had been bound to happen. Destiny could never leave him alone for long, and it must have been at least a week since anything exciting had happened to him. But now that would all be put right. And there would be trouble and adventure and mystery again, and with a little luck, some boodle at the end. That was all that mattered. Somewhere in this delirious business of medical tea and Bank of England notes, there must be crime and dark conspiracies and all manner of mischief. He couldn't surmise yet what kind of racket it could subsist on trading handfuls of banknotes for half-crowns, but it was even harder to imagine anything like that in a line of legitimate business, So some racket or other it must be, and new rackets could never be altogether dull. He parked the car illegally on the corner of Victoria Street and got out. "Let's walk," he said. He took Patricia's arm and strolled with her up the street, and as they went, he burbled exuberantly. Maybe it's an eccentric millionaire who suffered from acute dyspepsia all his life. And in his will he directed that all his fortune was to be distributed among other sufferers, because he knew that there wasn't really any cure at all, but at least the money would be some consolation. So without any publicity, his executors had the dough wrapped up in packets labeled as an indigestion cure, feeling pretty sure nobody who didn't have indigestion would buy it, and thereby saving themselves the trouble of sorting through a lot of applicants with bogus bellyaches. Or maybe it's some guy who made all the money in the world out of defrauding the poor, nitwitted public with various patent medicines, whose conscience has pricked him in his old age, so that he's trying to fix himself up for the hereafter by making restitution. And the most appropriate way you can think of to do that is to distribute the geetus in the shape of another patent medicine, figuring that this is the way it's most likely to fall into the same hands that it originally came from. Or maybe, said Patricia, this is the place you're looking for. Simon stopped walking and looked at it. There was a show card in the center of the window, the same card, as a matter of fact, which Mr. Teal had seen, but the saint was taking no chances. "Let's make sure," he said. He led her the rest of the way up the street for a block beyond the turning where Mr. Teal would have branched off in the most direct route of his lodgings, and back down the opposite side, but no other drugstore window revealed a similar sign. Simon stood on the other side of the road again, and gazed across at the brightly lighted window which they had first looked at. He read the name, Henry Osbett and Company, across the front of the shop. He let go of Patricia's arm. "Toddle over, darling," he said, "and buy me a packet of medical tea." "What happens if I get shot?" she asked suspiciously. "I shall bear the bang," he said, "and phone for an ambulance." Two minutes later, she rejoined him with a small, neat parcel in her hand. He fell in beside her as she came across the road and turned in the direction of the lower end of the street where he had left the car. "How was Comrade Osbett?" he murmured. "Still keeping up with the world?" "He looked all right, as if he was the fellow who served me." She passed him the packet she was carrying. "Now, do you mind telling me what good this is supposed to do?" "I must listen to one of the broadcasts and find out. According to the wrapper, it disperses bile." She reached across to his hip pocket, and he laughed. "Okay, darling, don't waste any bullets. We may need them. I just wanted to find out if there were any curious features about buying medical tea. I didn't want to go in myself because I'm liable to want to go in again without being noticed too much." "I didn't see anything curious," she said. "I just asked for it, and he wrapped it up and gave it to me." "Well, no questions of stalling?" "No, it was just like buying a toothbrush or anything else." Didn't he seem to be at all interested in who was buying it? Not a bit. He held the package to his ear, shook it, and crunched it speculatively. "We'll have a drink somewhere and see if we won anything," he said. At a secluded corner table in the Florida, a while later, he opened the packet, with the same care to preserve the seals and wrappings as he had given to the first consignment, and tipped out the contents onto a plate. The contents, to any ordinary examination, consisted of nothing but tea, and by the smell and feel of it, not very good tea either. The saint laughed, or sighed, rather, and called a waiter to remove the mess. "It looks as if we're wrong about that eccentric millionaire," he said, "or else the supply of do-re-mi has run out. Well, I suppose we'll just have to go to work again." He folded the container and stowed it carefully away in his pocket, and if he was disappointed, he was able to conceal his grief. A glimmer of reckless optimism curled the corners of his mouth. "You know, darling, I have a hunch that some interesting things are going to happen before this time tomorrow night." He was a better prophet than he knew, and it took only a few hours to prove it. Chapter 5. Simon Templar slept like a child. A thunderstorm bursting over his roof would not have woken him. A herd of wild elephants stampeding past his bed would scarcely have made him stir. But one kind of noise that other ears might not have heard at all, even in the full wakefulness, brought him back instantaneously to life, with every faculty sharpened and on tiptoe. He awoke in a breathless flash, like a watchdog, without the slightest perceptible alteration in his rate of breathing or any sudden movement. Anyone standing near him would not have even sensed the change that had taken place. But his eyes were half open, and his wits were skidding back over his last split second of sleep like the recoil of taut elastic, searching for a definition of the sound that had roused him. The luminous face of a clock across the room told him he had slept less than 2 hours, and the tiny phosphorescent hands hadn't moved on enough for the naked eye to see when he knew why he was awake. In the adjoining living room, something human had moved. Simon drew down the automatic from under his pillow and slid out of bed like a phantom. He left the communicating door alone and sidled noiselessly through the other door which led out into the hall. The front door was open just enough to split the darkness with a knife edge of illumination from the lights on the landing outside. He eased over to it like a cat, slipped his fingers through the gap, and felt the burred edges of the hole which had been drilled through the outside of the frame so that the catch of the spring lock could be pushed back. A light blinked beyond the open door of the living room. The saint came to the entrance and looked in. Silhouetted against the subdued glow of an electric torch, he saw the shape of a man standing by the table with his back to the door, and his bare feet patted over the carpet, without a breath of sound until they were almost under the intruder's heels. He leaned over until his lips were barely a couple of inches from the visitor's right ear. "Boo," said the saint. It was perhaps fortunate for the intruder he had a strong heart, for if he had had the slightest cardiac weakness, the nervous shock which spun him around would have probably popped it like a balloon. As it was, an involuntary yammer of sheer primitive fright dribbled out of his throat, or he lashed out blindly in no less instinctive self-defense. Simon had anticipated that. He was crouching almost to his knees by that time, and his left arm snaked around the lower part of the man's legs simultaneously with a quick thrust of his shoulder against the other's thighs. The burglar went over backwards with a violent thud, and as most of his breath jolted out of him, he freighted it with a selection of picturesque expletives which opened up new vistas of biologic theory. One hand, swinging up in a vicious arc, was caught clearly in the beam of the fallen flashlight, and it was not empty. "I think," said the saint, "we can do without the persuader." He jabbed the muzzle of his gun very hard into the place where his guest's ribs forked, and heard a satisfactory gasp of pain in response. His left hand caught the other's wrist as it descended, twisted with all the skill of a manipulative surgeon, and let it go again to grab the life-preserver as it dropped out of the man's numbed fingers. "You mustn't hit people with things like this," he said reprovingly. "It hurts, doesn't it?" The intruder, with jagged stars shooting through his head, did not offer an opinion, but his squirming lost nearly all of its early vigor. The saint sat on him easily, and made sure that there were no other weapons on his person before he stood up again. The main lights clicked on with a sudden dazzling brightness. Patricia Holmes stood in the doorway, the lines of her figure draping exquisite contours into the folds of a filmy negligee. Her fair hair tousled with sleep and hazy startlement in her blue eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know you had company." "That's all right," said the saint. "We're keeping open house." He lounged back to rest the base of his spine against the edge of the table and inspected the collar in more detail. He saw a short-legged, barrel-chested individual with a thatch of carroty hair, a wide, coarse-lipped mouth, and a livid scar running from one side of a flattened nose to near the lobe of a misshapen ear, and recognition dawned in his gaze. He waved his gun in genial pleasure. "You remember our old pal and playmate, Red Maguire?" he murmured. "Just back from a holiday at Parkhurst after his last job of robbery with violence. Somebody told him about all those jewels we keep round, and he couldn't wait to drop in and see them. Why don't you ring the bell, Red? Save yourself the trouble of carving up the door." Maguire sat on the floor and tentatively rubbed his head. "Okay, I can do without the funny stuff. Go on and call the cops." Simon considered the suggestion. It seemed a very logical procedure, but it left an unfinished edge of puzzlement still in his mind. There was something about finding himself the victim of an ordinary burglary that didn't quite ring bells. He knew well enough that his reputation was enough to make any ordinary burglar steer as far away from him as the landscape would allow, and serious burglars didn't break into any dwelling chosen at random and hope for the best without even knowing the identity of the occupant. Certainly not burglars with the professional status of Red Maguire. Therefore, his eyes drained detail from the scene with fine drawn intentness. Nothing seemed to have been touched. Perhaps he had arrived too quickly for that. Everything was as he had left it when he went to bed, except the emptied packet of medical tea, which Patricia had bought for him that evening, was still in his coat pocket. The packet, which he had refilled for Teal's personal consumption, was still on the table. Or was it? For on the floor, a yard from where Red Maguire had fallen, laid another identical packet of medical tea. Simon absorbed the jar of realization without batting an eyelid, but a slowly increasing joy crept into the casual radiance of his smile. "Why ask me to be so unfriendly, Red?" he drawled. "After all, what's a packet of tea between friends?" If he needed any confirmation of his surmise, he had it in the way Red Maguire's small green eyes circled the room and froze on the yellow carton beside him before they switched furtively back to the saint's face. "What tea?" Maguire mumbled sullenly. "Medical tea," said the saint gently. "The juice that pours balm into the twinging tripes. That's what you came here for tonight, Red. You came here to swipe my beautiful packet of gut grease and leave some phony imitation behind instead." Maguire glowered at him stubbornly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" said the saint, and his smile had become almost affectionate. "Then you're going to find the next half hour tremendously instructive." He straightened up and reached over for a steel chair that stood close to him and slid it across in the direction of his guest. "Don't you find the floor rather hard?" he said. "Take a pew, make yourself happy, because it looks as if we may be in for a longish talk." A wave of his gun added a certain amount of emphasis to the invitation, and there was a crispness in his eyes that carried even more emphasis than the gun. Maguire hauled himself up hesitantly and perched on the edge of the chair, and the saint beamed at him. "Now, if you'll look in the top drawer of the desk, Pat. I think there's quite a collection of handcuffs there. About 3 pairs ought to be enough. One for each of his ankles, one to fasten his hands behind him." Maguire shifted where he sat. "What's the idea?" he demanded uneasily. "Just doing everything we can to make you feel at home," answered the saint breezily. "Would you mind putting your hands behind you so that the lady can fix you up? Thank you ever so much. Now, if you'll just move your feet back up against the legs of the chair." Rebellious rage boiled behind the other's sulky scowl, a rage that had its roots in a formless but intensifying fear. But the saint's steady hand held the conclusive argument, and he kept that argument accurately aligned on Maguire's wishbone until the last cuff had been locked in place and the strong-arm expert was shackled to the steel chair frame as solidly as if he had been riveted onto it. Then Simon put down his automatic and languidly flipped open the cigarette box. "I hate to do this to you," he said conversationally, "but we really got to do something about that memory of yours. Or have you changed your mind about answering a few questions?" Maguire glared at him without replying. Simon touched a match to his cigarette and glanced at Patricia through a placid trail of smoke. "Can I trouble you some more, darling? If you wouldn't mind plugging in that old electric curling iron of yours." Maguire's eyes jerked and the handcuffs clinked as he strained suddenly against them. "Go on. Why don't you call the cops?" he blurted hoarsely. "You can't do anything to me." The saint strolled over to him. "Just who do you think is going to stop me?" he asked kindly. He slipped his hands down inside Maguire's collar, one on each side of the neck, and ripped his shirt open clear to the waist with one swift wrench that sprang the buttons pinging across the room like bullets. "Get a good and hot, darling," he said over his shoulder, "and we'll see how dear old Red likes the hair on his chest waved." Chapter 4. Chapter 6. Red Maguire stared up at the saint's gentle smile and ice-cold eyes, and the breath stopped in his throat. He was by no means a timorous man, but he knew when to be afraid, or thought he did. "You ain't giving me the chance, governor," he whined. "Why don't you ask me something I can answer? I don't want to give no trouble." Simon turned away from him to flash a grin at Patricia, a grin that Maguire was never meant to see. "Go ahead and get the iron, sweetheart," he said, with blood-curdling distinctness, and winked at her, just in case dear old Red changes his mind. Then the wink and the grin vanished together as he whipped around on his prisoner. "All right," he snapped. "Tell me all you know about medical tea." "I don't know anything about it, so help me, governor. I never heard of it before tonight. All I know is I was told to come here with a packet, And if I found another packet, I was to swap 'em over and bring your packet back. That's all I know about it. Strike me dead if it ain't. I shall probably strike you dead if it is, said the saint coldly. You mean to tell me that Comrade Osbert didn't say any more than that? Who's that? I said Osbert. You know who I'm talking about. Well, I never heard of him. Simon moved towards him with one fist drawn back. Oh, that's the God's own truth, shouted Maguire desperately. Oh, I said I'd tell you anything I could, couldn't I? It ain't my fault I don't know everything. Then who was it that told you to come here and play tea parties? Well, I don't know. Listen, begged Maguire frantically. This is a squeal, eh? Well, why don't you believe me? I'll tell you, I don't know. It was someone who met me when I come out of stir. I don't know what his name is. This business, you don't ask questions. He says to me, what, like 50 quid a week to do any dirty work where it's going, more or less. I says, for 50 quid a week, I'll do anything he can think of. So he gives me 20 quid on account and tells me to go anywhere where there's a telephone and just sit there beside it until he calls me. So tonight, he rings up, and you never knew who he was. Never in my life. Struck me dead. How do you get the rest of your money? He just makes a date to meet me somewhere and hands it over. And you don't even know where he lives. So help me, I don't. All I got's a phone number where I can ring him. What's this number? Berkeley 3100. Simon studied him calculatingly. The story had at least a possibility of truth, and the way Maguire told it, it sounded convincing. But the saint didn't let any premature camaraderie soften his implacably dissecting gaze. He said, what sort of a guy is he? A tall, thin, foreign-looking bloke with a black beard. It still sounded possible. Whatever Mr. Osbert's normal appearance might be, and whatever kind of racket he might be in, he might easily be anxious not to have his identity known by such dubiously efficient subordinates as Red Maguire. And exactly how, said the saint, did your foreign-looking bloke know that I had any medicals in the house? Well, I don't know. Patricia Home came back to the room with a curling iron that glowed dull red. Simon turned and reached for it. Ah, you're just in time, darling, he murmured. Comrade Maguire's memory is coming back on him again. Comrade Maguire gaped at the hot iron and licked his lips. I found that out myself, Governor, he said hurriedly. I was going to tell you. How did you find out? I heard something on the telephone. Saint's eyes narrowed. Where? In the first house I went to, somewhere near Victoria Station. That was where I was told to go first and swoop over the tea. I got it all right, but the bloke was there in the bedroom. I could hear him tossing about in bed. I was standing outside the door, wondering if I should jump in and cosh him, when the telephone rang. I listened to what he said, and all of a sudden, I guess it was about some tea, and then once he called you saint, I knew who he must be talking to. So, got out again and phoned the governor and told him about it. And he says, go ahead and do the same thing here. Simon thought back over his conversation with Mr. Teal, and belief grew upon him. No liar could have invented that story, for it hung on the fact of a telephone call which nobody else besides Teal and Patricia and himself could have known about. He could see how the mind of Mr. Osbert would have worked on it. Mr. Osbert would already know that someone had interrupted the attempt to recover the package of tea from Chief Inspector Teal on his way home, and that someone had arrived in a car, and that he had presumably driven Teal the rest of the way after the rescue. If someone was phoning Teal later about a packet of tea, the remainder of the sequence of accidents would have only taken a moment to reconstruct. And when the saint thought about it, he would have given a fair percentage of his £1,500 for a glimpse of Mr. Osbert's face when he learned into what new hands the packet of tea had fallen. He still looked at Red Maguire. How would you like to split this packet of tea with me? He asked casually. Maguire blinked at him. Blimey, Governor, what would I do with a packet of tea? Simon did not try to enlighten him. The answer was enough to consolidate the conclusion he had already reached. Red Maguire really did not know what it was all about. That was also becoming credible. After all, any intelligent employer would know that Red Maguire was not a man who could be safely led into temptation. The saint had something else to think about. His own brief introductory anonymity was over, and henceforward all the attentions of the ungodly would be lavished on himself. And he was still without one single solid target to shoot back at. He sank into a chair and blew the rest of his cigarette into a meditative chain of smoke rings. And then he crushed the butt into an ashtray and looked at McGuire again. "What happens to your 50 quid a week job if you go back to stir, Red?" he inquired deliberately. The thug chewed his teeth. "Suppose it's all over with, governor." "How would you like to phone your boss now? For me?" Fear swelled in McGuire's eyes again as the saint's meaning wore its way relentlessly into his understanding. His mouth opened once or twice without producing any sound. You can't ask me to do that," he got out at last. "If he knew I double-crossed him, he said—" Simon rose with a shrug. "Just as you like," he said carelessly, "but one of us is going to use the telephone, and I don't care which is his. If I ring up Vine Street and tell them to come over and fetch you away, I should think you get about 10 years with a record like yours. Still, they say it's a healthy life with no worries." "Well, wait a minute," McGuire said chokily. "What'll you do if I make this call?" "I'll give you 100 quid in cash, and I'll guarantee that when I'm through with your boss, he won't be able to do any of those things he promised." McGuire was no mathematician, but he could do simple arithmetic. He gulped something out of his throat. "All right, it's a bet." Simon summed him up for a moment longer, and then hauled his chair over to within reach of the table where the telephone stood. He picked up the receiver and prodded his forefinger into the first perforation of the dial. "All you're going to do," he said, as he went on spelling out BER 3100, "is to tell the big bearded chief that you've been through this place with a fine comb, and the only tea leaf in it is yourself. You get it? No saint, no tea, no soap. I don't want to frighten you or anything like that, Red, but I just want you to remember that if you try to say any more than that, I've still got you here and we can easily warm up the curling tongs again." "Don't you think I know what's good for me?" retorted the other sourly. The saint nodded warily and heard the ring of the call in the receiver. It was answered almost at once in a sharp, cultured voice with a slight foreign intonation. "Yes? Who is that?" Simon put the mouthpiece to McGuire's lips. "McGuire calling," said the burglar thickly. "Well?" "No luck, Governor. It ain't here. Saint's out, so I had plenty of time. Couldn't have helped finding it if I'd been here." There was a long pause. "All right," said the voice curtly. "Go home and wait for further orders. I'll call you tomorrow." The line went down with a click. "And I wouldn't mind betting," said the saint, as he put the receiver back, "that that's the easiest 100 quid you've ever earned." McGuire tugged impatiently at his manacles. "Well, you got what you wanted, did you? Come on and take off these ruddy baseless and let me go." The saint shook his head. "Not quite so fast, brother," he said. "You might think of calling up your boss again and having another chat with him before you went to bed. And I'd hate him to get worried at this hour of the night. Now you stay right where you are and get some of that beauty sleep which you need so badly. Because after what I'm going to do tomorrow, your boss may be looking for you with a gun." Chapter 7. Early rising had never been one of the saint's favorite virtues, but there were times when business looked more important than leisure. It was 11 o'clock the next morning, an hour at which he was usually beginning to think drowsily about breakfast, when he sauntered into the apothecarium of Mr. Henry Osbett. In honor of the occasion, he had put on his newest and most beautiful suit, a creation in pearl grey fresco, over which his tailor had shed tears of ecstasy in the fitting room. His piratically tilted hat was unbelievably spotless. His tie would have humbled the gaudiest hues of dawn. He had also put on, at less expense, a vacuous expression and an inanely chirpy grin that completed the job of typing him to the point where his uncle, the gouty Duke, loomed almost visibly in his background. The shifty-eyed young assistant who came to the counter might have been pardoned for keeling over backwards at the spectacle, but he only recoiled half a step and uttered a perfunctory, "Yes, sir." He looked nervous and preoccupied. Simon wondered whether this nervousness and preoccupation might have had some connection with a stout and agitated-looking man who had entered the shop a few yards ahead of the saint himself. Simon's brightly vacant eyes took in the essential items of the topography without appearing to notice anything. The counter with its showcases and displays of patent pills and liver salts. The glazed compartment at one end where presumably prescriptions were dispensed. The dark doorway at the other end, which must have led to the intimate fastnesses of the establishment. Nowhere was the stout man visible, and therefore, unless he had dissolved into thin air or disguised himself as a bottle of Bunyan cure, he must have passed through that one doorway. Prospects began to look even more promising than the saint had expected. "This jolly old tea, old boy," bleated the saint, producing a package from his pocket. "A friend of mine, chappie named Teal, you know, great detective, all that sort of thing, bought it off you last night and then decided he wouldn't risk taking it. He's going to throw it down the drain." I said to him, "Why waste a perfectly good $half, what?" And I said, "I bet they change it for a cake of soap or something." I said, "I'll take it in and change it myself," I told him. "That's right, isn't it? You will change it, won't you?" The shifty-eyed youth was a bad actor. His face had gone white, then red, and finally compromised by remaining blotchy. He gaped at the packet as if he were really starting to believe that there were miracles in miracle tea. We should be glad to change it for you, sir," he gibbered. "Fine," chortled the saint. "That's what I told jolly old Teal. You take the tea and give me a nice box of soap. I expect Teal can use that, but I'm dashed if I know what he could do with the tea." He was talking to a vanishing audience. The youth, with a spluttered "Excuse me, sir," had grabbed the package off the counter and was already making a dive for the doorway at the far end, and the imbecile grin melted out of the saint's face like a wax mold from a casting of hot bronze. One skeleton instant after, the assistant had disappeared. He was over the counter with the swift silence of a cat. But even if he had made any noise, it's doubtful whether the other would have noticed it. The shifty-eyed youth was so drunk with excitement that his brain had for the time being practically ceased to function. If it hadn't, he might have stopped to wonder why Mr. Teal should have handed the tea to a third party, or why the third party, being so obviously a member of the idle rich, should have even bothered about exchanging it for a box of soap. He might have asked himself a great many inconvenient questions, but he didn't. Perhaps the peculiarly fatuous and guileless character which the saint had adopted for the interview had something to do with that egregious oversight. At least, that was what Simon Templar had hoped for, and it is at least certain that the young man went blundering up the stairs without a backward glance, while the saint glided like a ghost into the gloomy passageway at the foot of the stairs. In the dingy upper room, which was the young man's destination, Mr. Osbert was entertaining the stout and agitated man. That is to say, he was talking to him. The agitated man did not look very entertained. "It's no good cursing me, Nancock," Osbert was saying in his flustered old maidish way. "Have you been on time last night?" "I was on time," yelped the perspiring Mr. Nancock. "It was that young idiot's fault for handing the package over without the password. And to Teal, of all people. I tell you, I've been through hell, waiting for something to happen every minute. Waiting. It's even safe for me to be here now." "That's true," said Osbert, one of his curiously abrupt transformations into deadly coldness. "Who told you to come here?" "I came here because I want my money," bawled the other hysterically. "What do you think I've done your dirty work for? You think I'd have taken a risk like this if I didn't need the money? Is it my fault if your fool of an assistant gives the money to the wrong man? I don't care a damn about your penny dreadful precautions and all this nonsense about signs and countersigns and keeping out of sight. What good has that done all this time? I tell you, if I think you're trying to cheat me—" "Cheat you?" repeated the chemist softly. The idea seemed to interest him. "Now, I wonder why you should be the first to think of that." There was a quality of menace in his voice which the stout man did not seem to hear. His mouth opened for a fresh outburst, but the outburst never came. The first word was on his lips when the door opened, and the shifty-eyed youth burst in without the formality of a knock. "It's Teal's packet," he panted out. "A man just came in and said he wanted to change it. He said Teal gave it to him. It hasn't even been opened." Hancock jumped up like a startled pig with his mouth still open where the interruption had caught it. An inarticulate yelp was the only sound that came out of it. Osbert got up more slowly. "What sort of man?" he snapped. And his voice was hard and suspicious. The youth wagged his hands vaguely. "Silly-ass sort of fellow. Burlington Bertie kind of chap. I didn't notice him particularly." "Well, go back and notice him now." Mr. Osbert was flapping diddily again. "Keep him talking. Make some excuse, but keep him there till I can have a look at him." The assistant darted out again and went pelting down the stairs, so precipitately that he never noticed the shadow that faded beyond the doorway of the stockroom on the opposite side of the landing. I see you. Welcome in, Fantasia. Welcome in. Osbert had seized the packet of tea and was feeling it eagerly. The suspicious look was still in his eyes, but his hands were shaking with excitement. It feels like it, he muttered. There's something funny about this. Funny? Squeaked Nancock shrilly. It's my money, isn't it? Give it to me and let me get out of here. It'll be lucky for you if it is your money, Osbert said thinly. Better let me make sure. He ripped open the package. There was no tea in it, only crumpled pieces of thin white paper. Yes, this is it. But why? My God! The oath crawled through his lips in a tremulous whisper. He looked as if he had opened the package and found a snake in his hands. Nancock, staring at him, saw that his face had turned into a blank grey mask, in which the eyes bulged like marbles. Osbert spread out the piece of paper which he had opened. It was not a banknote. It was simply a piece of perforated tissue, on which had been stamped in red the drawing of a quaint little figure, with straight lines for body and legs and arms, and an elliptical halo slanted over his round, featureless head. Osbert tore open the other papers with suddenly savage hands. Each and every one of them was the same, stamped with the same symbolic figure. "The saint!" he whispered. Nancock goggled stupidly at the scattered drawings. I don't understand, he faltered. He was white at the lips. Osbert looked up at him. Then you better start thinking, he rasped. And his eyes had gone flat and emotionless again. The saint sent this, and if he knows about the money... Not sent, dear old Whiskers, not sent. A coolly mocking voice corrected him from the doorway. I brought it along myself, just for the pleasure of seeing your happy faces. The saint stood leaning against the jamb of the door, smiling and debonair. I'm perceiving. Perceive all you like, my dear. Chapter 8. The two men stood and gawped at him as if he had been a visitor from Mars. A gamut of emotions must have strained their endocrine glands to the bursting point, skittered over their faces like foam over a waterfall. They looked as if they had been simultaneously goosed with high-voltage wires and slugged in the solar plexus with invisible sledgehammers. Simon had to admit there was some excuse for them. In fact, he had himself intentionally provided the excuse. There were certain reactions which only the ungodly could perform in their full richness that never failed to give him the same exquisite and fundamental joy that the flight and impact of a well-aimed custard pie gives to a movie audience, and for some seconds he was regaled with as ripe and rounded an exhibition of its kind as the hungriest heart could desire. The saint propped himself a little more comfortably against his backrest and flicked a tiny bombshell of ash from his cigarette. I hope you don't mind my asking myself in like this, he remarked engagingly, but I thought we ought to get together on this tea business. Maybe I can give you some new ideas. I was mixing a few odds and ends together myself yesterday. Credit must be given to Mr. Osbert for making the first recovery. He was light years ahead of Nancock, who stood as if his feet had sunk into the floor above the ankles, looking as though his lower jaw had dislocated itself at its fullest stretch. In one fleeting flash of dazzling clarity, it dawned upon him that the man who stood there was unarmed, that the saint's hands were empty except for a cigarette. His mouth shut tight under the spreading plumes of his moustache as he made a lightning grab towards the inside of his coat. Really, protested the saint, weren't you ever taught not to scratch yourself in public? Osbert had just time to blink once, and then he felt as if a cyclone had hit him. His fingers had not even closed on the butt of the automatic in his shoulder holster when he found himself full in the path of what seemed like a ton of incarnate dynamite, moving with the speed of an express train. Something like a chunk of teak zoomed out of the cyclone and collided with his jaw. As if from a great distance he heard it make a noise like a plank snapping in half. Then his head seemed to split open and let in a gash of light, through which his brain sank down into cottony darkness. The rest of him cannoned soggily into Nancock, bounded sideways and cascaded over a chair. Osbert and the chair crashed to the floor together, and the stout man reeled drunkenly. He began. Perhaps he did not mean the word as an invitation, but it appeared to have that effect. Something possessed of staggering velocity and hardness accepted the suggestion and moved into his stomach. The stout man said, "Oof!" and folded over like a jackknife. This put his chin in line with another projectile that seemed to be traveling up from the floor. His teeth clicked together, and he lay down quite slowly like a collapsing concertina. Simon Templar straightened his tie and picked up the cigarette, which he had dropped when the fun started. It had not even had time to scorch the carpet. He surveyed the scene with a certain shadow of regret. That was the worst of having to work quickly. It merely whetted the appetite for exercise and then left nothing for it to expend itself on. However, it was doubtful whether Osbert and Nancock could ever have provided a satisfactory workout, even with plenty of time to develop it. The Saint relieved Osbert of his gun, felt Nancock's pockets for a weapon and found nothing, and then rose quickly as the scutter of footsteps on the stairs reminded him that he still had one more chance to practice his favorite uppercut. He leaped behind the door as the shifty-eyed assistant tumbled in. The assistant was blurting out his news when he came. "Oi, the fellow's disappeared." Simon towed the door away from between them and grinned at him. "Oh, where do you think he went to?" he inquired interestedly. His fist jolted up under the youth's jaw, and the assistant sat down and unrolled himself backwards and lay still. The Saint massaged his knuckles contentedly and pulled a large roll of adhesive tape from his pocket. "Ah, Andres one, thank you for following." Hello there. Welcome in." "Thank you so much for the follow. We are reading a portion of the book Follow the Saint by Leslie Charteris." He used it to fasten the three sleeping beauties' hands and feet together, and had enough left to fasten over their mouths in a way that would gravely handicap any loquacity which they might be moved when they woke up. Not that they were showing any signs of waking up for some time to come, which was another disadvantage attached to the effectiveness of that sizzling uppercut. By all the symptoms, it would be quite a while before they were in any condition to start a conversation. It was an obstacle to further developments which Simon had not previously considered, and he scratched his head over it in a moment of indecision. As a matter of fact, he had not given much previous consideration to anything beyond that brief and temporarily conclusive scuffle. He never made any definitive plans on such occasions, but he had an infinite faith in impromptu action and the bountiful inspirations of Providence. Meanwhile, no harm would probably be done by making a quick and comprehensive search of the premises, or in the stillness of his meditation and the surrounding atmosphere of sleep, an assortment of sounds penetrated to his ears from the regions downstairs. There was some forced and pointed coughing, an impatient shuffling of feet, and the tapping of a coin on plate glass. More business had apparently arrived, and it was getting restive. A faintly thoughtful tilt edged itself into his eyebrows. He glanced around the room and saw a slightly grubby white coat hanging behind the door. In a moment, he had slipped into it and was buttoning it as he skated down the stairs. The customer was a fat and frowsy woman in a bad temper. "Take your time, don't you?" she said scathingly. "Think I've got all the waste, young man? You're new here, ain't you? Where's Mr. Osbert?" "Some people, madam, prefer to call me Fresh," replied the Saint courteously. "Mr. Osbert is asleep at the moment, but he may confide in me with perfect confidence." "Confide in you?" retorted the lady indignantly. "None of your sauce, young feller. I want 3 pennyworth of licorice and chlorodyne lozenges, and that's all. Young Alf's cough is awful bad again this morning." "That's too bad," said the Saint, giving the shelves a quick once-over and feeling somewhat helpless. "Just a minute, auntie. I'm still finding my way around." "Fresh," said the lady tartly, "is right." Licorice and chlorodyne lozenges were fairly easy. The Saint found a large bottle of them after a short search and proceeded to tip half of it into a paper bag. "I don't want all that," yelped the woman. 3 pennyworth, I said. Simon pushed the bag over the counter. "As an old and valued customer, please accept the extra quantity with Mr. Osbert's compliments," he said generously. 3 pence is the price to you, madame, and a bottle of cough mixture thrown in. Oh, yes, and you better give young Alf some cod liver oil." He piled the merchandise toward her until she grabbed up as much as she could carry and palpitated nervously out into the street. Simon grinned to himself and hoped he had not overdone it. In the news of his sensational bargain sales spread around the district, he would have his hands full. During the lull that followed, he tried to take a survey of the stock. He would be safe enough with proprietary goods, but if anyone asked for some more complicated medicine, he would have to be careful. He had no grudge to work off against the neighborhood at large, which was almost a pity. The next customer required nothing more difficult than aspirin, and left the shop in a kind of daze when the Saint insisted on supplying a bottle of 100 tablets for the modest price of 2 pence. Simon took a trip upstairs and found that his 3 prizes had still failed to progress beyond the stage of half-consciousness meanings, and a spasmodic twitching of the lower limbs. He returned downstairs to attend to a small snotty-nosed urchin who was asking for a shilling tin of baby food. Simon blandly handed her the largest size he could see and told her that Mr. Osbert was making special reductions that morning. "Co," said the small child, and added a bag of pear drops to the order. Simon poured out a pound of them. "No charge for that, Delilah. Mr. Osbert's giving pear drops away for an advertisement," and the small child sprinted out as if it was afraid of waking up before it got home. The saint lit another cigarette and waited thoughtfully. Supplying everybody who came in with astounding quantities of Mr. Osbert's goods at cutthroat prices was amusing enough, admittedly, but it was not getting him anywhere, and yet a hunch that was growing larger every minute kept him standing behind the counter. Maybe it wasn't such a waste of time. The package of medical tea in which he had found 1,500 testimonials to the lavish beneficence of his guardian angel had come from that shop. Presumably it had been intended for some special customer. Presumably, also, it was not the only eccentric transaction that had taken place there, and there was no reason why it should be the last. Maybe no other miracles of the same kind were timed to take place that day. And yet... Mr. Osbert's boxes of extra special toilet soap, usually priced at 7 and 6pence, were reduced for the benefit of a charming young damsel to a shilling each. The charming damsel was so impressed that she tentatively inquired the price of a handsome bottle of bath salts. "Oh, what, this?" said the saint, taking the bottle down and wrapping it up. "As a special bargain this morning, sweetheart. We're letting it go for 6pence. It went for 6pence quickly. The saint handed over her change without encouraging further orders. As a matter of fact, he was rather anxious to get rid of the damsel, in spite of her charm and obvious inclination to be friendly, for a man with a thin weasel face under a dirty tweed cap, already overdue for the dustbin, had come in, and was earnestly inspecting a showcase full of safety razors and other articles which are less widely advertised. Quite obviously, the man was not anxious to draw attention to himself while there was another customer in the shop, and while there was at least one perfectly commonplace explanation for that kind of bashfulness, the saint felt a spectral tingle of expectation slide over his scalp as the girl went out and Weasel Face angled over the counter. "I haven't seen you before," he stated. His manner was flatly casual, but his small beady eyes flitted over Simon's face like flies hovering. "Then you should be enjoying the view," said the saint affably. "What can I say you today, comrade? Hot water bottles, shaving cream, toothpaste? We have a special bargain line of castor oil. Where's Ossie?" "Dear old Ossie is lying down for a while. I think he's got a headache or something, but don't let that stop you. Have you tried some of our passion flower lipstick? Guaranteed to seduce at the first application." The man's eyes circled around again. He pushed out a crumpled envelope. "Give Ossie my prescription and don't talk too much." "Just a minute," said the saint. He took the envelope back toward the staircase and slit it open. One glance, even in the dim light that penetrated there, was enough to show him that whatever else the thin sheet of paper it contained might mean, it was not a prescription that any ordinary pharmacist could have filled. He stuffed the sheet into his pocket and came back. "Will you call again at 6 o'clock?" he said, and his flippancy was no longer obtrusive. "I'll have it ready for you then." "All right." The beady eyes sailed over him once more, a trifle puzzledly, and the man went out. Simon took the paper back into the dispensing room and spread it out under a good light. It was a scale plan of a building, with every detail plainly marked, even to the positions of the larger pieces of furniture, and provided in addition with a closely written fringe of marginal notes, which to the saint's professional scrutiny provided every item of information that a careful burglar could have asked for, and the first fascinating but still incomplete comprehension of Mr. Osbert's extraordinary business began to reveal itself to him as he studied it. That brings us to Chapter 9, and we're at nearly the 2-hour mark. I think we'll go ahead and leave it on a cliffhanger for tonight, and we'll pick it up next week. So I think that's a good spot to stop. Let's see here. Let me go ahead and put the website out here one more time. All links available at lordrexworth.com. Again, that is lordrexworth.com. Of course, got the throne page. Gifts always appreciated, but never required by His Lordship. You can check out my throne page at throne.com/Lord Rexworth. Do give me a follow on the Twitter. Follow His Lordship on Twitter. Twitter.com/Lord Rexworth. The gates of Castle Rexworth are open to all. Join the Castle Rexworth Discord by clicking the link there in chat. And you can support his lordship through purchases at the Throne Shop, lordrexworth.store. Again, lordrexworth.store. And of course, if you enjoyed this program tonight, you can support his lordship directly with a donation via Stream Elements. The link is there in the chat. And with that, I thank you all so very much for joining me. Let's give some shout-outs real quick to people who have followed in the past 24 hours. Of course, we cannot forget the dear lovely Fantasia VT. Thank you so much for the follow there, Fantasia. Next up, Bubbles_836, thank you so much for the follow. And of course, Andres1. Thank you very much for the follow. Hope all of you enjoyed tonight. Let's find somebody to raid here. Let's see, I think... Let's see who's streaming tonight. We've got Razorwind playing Fear. Let's see, Ninon playing Valorant. Mekan playing Pokemon Scarlet. Rini playing Pokemon Infinite. That's Shiroi playing Postal 4. Let's see, who have we not raided in a while? Oh, you know what? Here's somebody we haven't raided in a long time. Of course, she hasn't been streaming around the same time as I have. Let's go raid Mekamata. He's playing Final Fantasy XIV online. And we'll get the copy pasta ready here. Alright, everybody, I'll see you on Thursday for Black Mesa, right here on Twitch. Until then, I'll see you on the Discord. I'm Lord Rexworth. Wish you all the best, and God bless.